Halo, Assalamualaikum. My name is Aceh Hasan Sazili. I am the chairman of Golkar Institute Indonesia. As we overcome the current global crisis, here my message to Global Town Hall 2022. Global and regional leaders and empowered citizens must cooperate cohesively and in peace. In line with this year G20 theme, recover together, recover stronger. I believe that collectively we can bring our countries towards sustainable and inclusive growth. How can we attain this growth? We start by prioritizing our investment in green, blue, and digital technologies. But if we want to obtain through sustainable growth, we must invest in our citizen civic knowledge about politics and geopolitics, as well as civic skill and behavior. Such skills include communication, advocacy, community organizing, innovation, and leadership. These skills are necessary for effective citizen participation, critical and rational thinking, and collective action. In Gokar Institute, we promote and advocate public policy education as the bedrock for aspiring young political leaders at the local, provincial, and national level. Our wide range of training program challenge to Indonesian youth to see local and global issues from various perspectives and bridge the gap through inclusive leadership. Ultimately, it is in the hand of leader and citizen to work equitably, strategically, and harmoniously to achieve the path of sustainable, resilient recovery for all. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure to join you for this global town hall. The world, indeed, appears divided and fragile. The recent UNDP Human Development Report shows that for the first time in over 3 decades, global human development declined for 2 consecutive years. Risks are converging rapidly, with vulnerable and conflict-affected countries often bearing the brunt. And the climate emergency is hitting much faster than many expected. Even before the pandemic, it was estimated that more than 80% of the extreme poor would live in fragile and conflict-affected countries by 2030. The senseless war in Ukraine is not only devastating the lives of millions of Ukrainians, it is also exacerbated a food, energy, and finance crisis affecting the most vulnerable globally. The link between peace and development is a critical opportunity for addressing these risks. That is why we need to turbocharge our commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals, which remains the most effective way to address root causes of conflict, prevent violence, and build peace. Achieving the SDGs is fundamental to the vision laid out in our common agenda, and must underpin the new agenda for peace. Lasting peace and development can only be achieved through a people-centered, inclusive, and gender-sensitive approach. Societies that exclude women and girls from leadership and decision-making and sideline their population will be more vulnerable to conflict and underdevelopment. We need stronger institutions. We need to foster engagement with civil society, particularly women and young people, and we need to learn from each other across the globe. Today's town hall, I hope, will contribute to this mission. I wish you fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Your Excellency Aminga Mohammed. My name is Michael Sheldrick, a global citizen, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's session on this triple threat catastrophe, which has really been years in the making. And, you know, we know that as bad as this impact is for everyone around the world, it's particularly worse for those living in low and lower middle income countries that are still reeling from the inequitable economic consequences of the past 2 years of limited trade, limited travel, burgeoning unsustainable debt, and the growing risks of economic recession next year. For our part at Global Citizen, we've been advocating in the lead up to the G20 and the COP27 to ensure governments meet the need for financing urgent humanitarian needs, investing in smallhold farmers to protect livelihoods, doubling adaptation funding, and increasing investment in long-term food security solutions. We're also calling on governments to increase their sharing of what's known as the IMF's special drawing rights. There might be an opportunity to discuss that later, to alleviate this crisis and give governments the extra cash they need to confront these crises. So what is the solution to these triple threat crises? What can our leaders be doing? And what can each of us be calling for? We've got an exciting panel to help us unpack this. But first, I want to give the floor to His Excellency Alvaro Lario, the President of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, to kick us off.
Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, the world has been battered over the past 2 years by a pandemic, by wildfires, floods, and droughts linked to climate change, and by a widening food and energy crisis caused by war in the Ukraine. As a global community, we have struggled to respond to protect economies, jobs, and most of all, people. Our response has frankly been uneven, sometimes resolute and coordinated, other times not as much. But what is clear is that we have been at our best when we have worked together, in partnership and for the common good. The G20 has the power to leverage that kind of partnership to literally change the world, to alter its course, and to steer us towards a sustainable future. At IFAD, we have worked for more than 4 decades to finance agriculture and rural development and lift up the world's poorest communities. Our eye has always been on the most vulnerable, the poor and the hungry. The small-scale farmers who grow so much of our food and who we need more than ever at times of crisis when trade, transport and markets are disrupted. The current spike in hunger, malnutrition and poverty is a warning to all of us. Of course, we must act quickly to relieve current suffering and provide relief. And at the same time, we must invest in recovery and resilience for a more sustainable future. Climate change is an existential threat, not tomorrow, but now. The crises we face today show how important it is to fully integrate emergency response and resilience building. Food systems are failing people, economies, and planet. Hunger will increasingly fuel instability, conflict, and migration unless we change how our food systems function and how they are financed. The cost of transforming our food systems from the farm through food processing, storage, and transport is estimated at around 300 to 400 billion a year until 2030. That may sound like a lot, but it's less than 0.5% of global GDP. It is also much less than annual agriculture subsidies, and it is just a fraction of the 10 trillion market value of the world's food systems. Currently, small farms receive less than 2% of global climate finance, though they produce a third of food. So let's not just talk about more investment, but the right investment. If resources are so scarce, why do we spend billions on the wrong things? At a time when governments are struggling to stave off disaster, it may seem unrealistic to propose a new and visionary rethinking of how we approach development finance. But if not now, when? Without long-term investment starting with the world's poorest and most vulnerable, we will be scraping public coffers to address one disaster after another until there is nothing left. And it's not just about public finance. We need global partnerships that bring together governments, the private sector, development banks, UN agencies, and poor rural people themselves. IFAD itself is an assembler of development finance targeted at the poorest people. Each dollar of core contributions to IFAD delivers $6 to $8 of investment through co-financing and partnerships. We will also continue to advocate strongly for more climate financing for poor and vulnerable farmers, because climate change is the biggest long-term threat to food systems on our planet. This will be the call to action we will bring to COP27. We look forward to working with G20 members on innovative ways to close the financing gap. Ladies and gentlemen, it is absolutely possible to feed everyone in the world, even at this time of multiple crises. Adaptive techniques and technology exist. For example, we've seen how simply replanting native grasses along rivers and ponds can improve climate resilience by creating breeding sites for fish and feed for domestic animals. With more fish to eat and better milk yields for livestock, communities can increase their income and improve nutrition. Solar-powered water pumps can reduce the risks of rain-fed farming. Remote sensing can tell farmers how much fertilizer their crops need. Drones can show farmers which plants are in poor health. But we will only succeed if we step up, scale up, and face up to the underlying and systemic problems within our food systems. So let's think long range and from the ground up and commit ourselves to work together. Let's start with food, because food security is national security. And until we improve local food production and value chain, we will pay an even higher price in never-ending emergency assistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Well, we've got a great panel, including Dr. Jose Aranjao Gurria, who is the former Secretary General of the OECD, and next year will take up the presidency of the Paris Peace Forum. Dr. Gurria, it's a pleasure to have you and congratulations on your new role. We also have Barbie Iski Aradu, who was the winner of this year's Global Citizen Prize and has been a tremendous advocate, most recently addressing the White House Hunger Summit. Barbie, congratulations again on your prize and all of your work. We're delighted to have you with us. So my first question is to Dr. Gurria. You know global economic governance better than anyone, and leading into the COP27 and the G20, there's been many calls, and we've heard some of that just now, but also from leaders such as Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados and others, for our international multilateral institutions, including the World Bank, the IMF, and others, to do more to address the impact of this triple threat crises for the most vulnerable. What can be done over the coming weeks? or will countries have to rely on their own resources?
You will have to deal with both. First of all, you have to recapitalize or increase the capital of institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, although they do different things, but both in the end provide resources to developing countries, but also increase the capital of the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the even institutions like Corporación Andina de Fomento, the European Investment Bank, which is larger than all the others put together, and they can help with the with developing countries. But and there's also Michael, a second question, which is, after you increase the capital of the institutions, then you have a question of leverage. That means, how many times do you use that capital to channel it to developing countries? And this is quite critical, because if we only would let the international development banks use the same leverage, use the capital to the same extent as we let the commercial banks, we could have a multiple of resources of the capital represented in these institutions. So I have been pursuing this, for years and years and years, since I was a finance minister, since I was the debt boss in Mexico, and then I was a finance minister and a foreign minister, and then when I was in the OECD. So the question of leverage. But I said both, in the sense that you also need domestic resource mobilization. And let me just tell you a very short story. We were in Ghana, and Trevor Manuel was taking the floor. Trevor Manuel from South Africa. And he was then the finance minister, and he was also involved in development issues, etc. And he suddenly stood up and asked all the audience, "How do you spell aid?" And everybody thought it was a very strange question, because everybody thought that, you obviously you spelled aid by AID, And he started saying, like in a revival, in one of those tent preachers, in the Midwest, he started saying TAX, 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 which suggested, of course, that you were talking about domestic resource mobilization, and that first you have to start with taxing the proper people. And we know that in developing countries, certainly there's a thinner tax base, but still, you also need to modify or to change the way in which the savings in those countries are allocated. And of course, you start by stemming the exodus of money, the exodus of capital. That means the drain of capital, the drain of savings, of domestic savings. That's the first thing you should do by providing the confidence. Now, having said all that, you also need the private sector. It's not just going to be the development banks. It's not just going to be the domestic resource mobilization. It's also going to be the private sector. Now, the private sector, from several sources. One of them is the credit, the export credits. You finance the people who are doing the imports from your own country, so they don't even have to take a country risk. But also, you have to rely on the private sector for loans for infrastructure, for the large infrastructure works. And now, it's as long as these infrastructure works pay for themselves, that is quite critical. That's very important, because otherwise it will be a burden for the country for future generations. But then also direct foreign investment. Direct foreign investment is the last source. The last source.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gurria. And I would say there's many people from Ghana in particular, and there was lots of chatter, and people appreciated what you're saying and the story and what you're championing. There seems to be a lot resonating for that at the grassroots. So thank you for what you're doing, and I hope we can return to the infrastructure piece shortly. But Barbie, over to you. You know, at a time when our world is divided, including within countries like the United States, how can we cushion the impact for the most vulnerable people?
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. We can cushion the impact to the most vulnerable by providing opportunities for engagement. When the people that are most heavily impacted by food insecurity can be the ones involved in the eradication of hunger, is when we see the most excitement, the most action here in the United States. People who are impacted by hunger are often left out of the rooms where decisions are being made for them. And by including people with lived experience, we can identify the harmful policies that need adjustments to bridge the gaps of service and inform policy. We need to make sure that we have programs that are addressing these issues and social determinants of health that people are facing that keep them trapped in these cycles of poverty. We need to make sure that programs like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, WIC, Women, Infants, and Children, and school meals are robustly funded and supported so that more families can have what they need for themselves and for their loved ones. We need a stronger safety net so that when people are prepared to no longer use these programs, that they're not abruptly cut off from the assistance that they need to keep them afloat until they are completely self-sufficient. We also need ethical engagement of the people experiencing the issue, because it grants us the gift of knowledge, and we can meet community members with the burning desire to help society because they're tired of seeing their own people suffer. At a time where countries are at odds, we must work on the issues that don't see color or geographical margins, because hunger and food insecurity happens everywhere. Where I come from, we're born into generational cycles of poverty that we have to battle our way out of, all while combating the stigmas that say that we're designed to fail or that people who need assistance are lazy. No one wants to live in poverty. No one wants to feel the rumble of hunger without the nourishment to make the pain stop. We want livable wages that provide the funds to bring back your dignity and feed your family. We need to focus on a paradigm shift that gives the community power over the decisions usually made for them to ensure equity and that there is in fact a shift of power. We must define equitable language that should be used from a trauma-informed lens to make sure that people feel safe, supported, and not just judged. We must come together and help each other, because the problem is not that there's not enough food, there's an abundance of food. We must cushion the impact by making sure that we're fighting for affordability so that people can afford the healthy foods that our bodies need. We need nutrition education that is provided in the most vulnerable neighborhoods so that people can learn how to prepare and cook the food with the knowledge of what's best for them in their own communities and not have to leave and travel distances just to get the things that they need. We need affordability. Our families across the country and the world need to be able to have nutritious meals that they can afford without having to compromise another bill like prescription medications or having their utilities shut off. We need accessibility. COVID has shown us that no matter where you are in the world, you can be affected by food insecurity. And through this experience, we saw the impact on rural communities, on cities, on urban places, and farmland. and even in more affluent communities, because COVID did not discriminate. And during this pandemic, we saw people from all walks of life in line waiting for assistance. And we need compassion and empathy, because this can happen to you. It can happen to anyone. And we should be helping our fellow global citizens. And empathy and compassion for someone else's circumstance costs us nothing. It brings us closer together, and builds movements while uplifting the needs, trust, and voices of people with lived experience. Thank you.
Barbie, we do indeed need compassion and empathy. And if you agree with Barbie, let it be known in the chat, and give a shout out to our incredible Global Citizen Prize winner. Dr. Gurria, coming back to you, I'm following the comments, and there's a lot of people agreeing with what you're saying, especially on inflation, debt relief. We know one of the biggest issues is the fact that as countries are reeling from unsustainable debt, they're paying more on resurfacing debt than they are on even meeting the needs of their own citizens. I know that's particularly the case in Ghana, where we've got people following and where you reference. But you also mentioned the role of the private sector. Look, we know all of the issues, it seems, but why is it so hard to achieve debt relief and to give developing countries extra cash to meet these crises?
It's not simple, especially in times of crises, because all the time the discourse says that charity starts at home. And of course, we forget about the fact that there are many more vulnerable people, many more times more vulnerable than we are. And that it's a question of hunger day to day. Now, after the pandemic, Michael, the OECD countries, the richest countries in the world, they invested more than 20% of their GDPs in fighting the pandemic. And then the GDP shrank. So in terms of the debt to GDP ratio, it really just blew up. Now, imagine how that is reflected in developing countries, which so it becomes, the impact is greater, the GDP shrinks, but also there's a great number of informal members of the economy, the economic agents. So you really need another HIPIC. You need another HIPIC. That means another initiative that reduces the debt of the developing countries. And you just can't get away from this. They're looking at whether 6 months and then another 6 months, and that doesn't work because it doesn't change the balance of the debt. It does not change the accumulation of the debt, which makes it impossible for the countries to grow. And now, by the way, you're going to get higher interest rates when you want to go to the market, because it's going to be a higher interest rate scenario in general. So you basically, I think countries must exercise, like Barbie suggested, compassion and empathy on the debt front. And to be practical, what you need is yet another HIPIC. The HIPIC was one of the most enlightened initiatives in the world at the time. But right now, circumstances would indicate very clearly that we need another such initiative, plus what we said in the beginning, more capital and more leverage from these international finance institutions, and also the confidence to get a flow of resources from the private sector, both in the form of direct foreign investment as well as in the form of export credit loans, and then loans we mentioned in particular for infrastructure, where you can commit the resources that are generated by the projects themselves as a source of repayment. And that can, that in the end can be the solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Gurria. And maybe we can return to the initiative you mentioned later on and the conditions and the role each of us can play as citizens in trying to bring that about. But Barbie, over to you. When President Biden was first elected president, he said the US would lead by the power of its example and not by the example of its power. You recently spoke at the White House Hunger Summit. In what ways is action on hunger at home in the United States connected to addressing hunger globally? And why is this important for America's image?
Thank you so much. So I actually did not formally speak at the White House Conference on Hunger, Health, and Nutrition, but I was invited as an attendee and was able to hear firsthand the promises and ideas shared by the President of the United States. Leading by power of example to me means that we're jumping into action. It means that we're taking this issue seriously and that we're going to produce results and best practices that can be shared. The United States is amongst the most powerful countries in the world, and true leadership is exactly that, using your power or influence for the greater good. It reminds me of economic justice, which to me is the sacrificing of systems for the greater good of the people. Addressing hunger locally grows, expands, and builds momentum for change. My advocacy started locally in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I never imagined that the things that I was doing just in North Philly would affect the world. And that my community would bring me today here to fighting hunger globally. Action at home is empowering. It shows you that your voice does matter. And because home is where the heart is, no matter where your home may be. Think about it. If you're on a plane and there's an emergency, you're asked to secure your mask before you can help someone else. That's because if all efforts are made outside, then you will be left behind. And that's not what we're trying to do. We want inclusivity. We want everyone to be able to have the help that they need. But when we start locally, it's because it's what's easiest. It's where we truly see how people are affected. And if one person from every community in the world took a stand and said, this matters to me, this needs to stop, and then connected to each other to help build partnerships, then we have a social justice movement under one common goal, and then we are a force of change. We are monuments in shaping the future for a more just and hunger-free world. We start at home because it's what's available to us. And if each of us did our part, then we can tackle hunger globally. President Biden stated that he has a goal of ending hunger by 2030. And I know so many grassroots organizations, so many advocates and people with lived experience who know that society needs to realize that hunger is not a they problem. Hunger and food insecurity is an us problem because it's affecting our seniors, our caregivers, and it's affecting our children, the future leaders of the world, the people that we are going to rely on to make sure that we are taken care of and to be able to move the country forward. The goal of ending hunger by 2030 should be a globally shared goal because we know that there's so many countries who can relate to the feeling of not having enough, no matter how hard they work or how hard they try. And that is an injustice. And as we all know, an injustice against one is an injustice against all. So we must fight to end this because no one deserves to go to bed hungry. That sentence means so much to me that I have to say it in my native tongue. Nadie merece la injusticia de estar trabajando para progresar y todavía no tener lo que necesita para darle comer a su familia. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Barbie. That was very powerful. So I want to invite some additional panelists to join us, offer their reflections and questions. Our first panelist is Rana Elwa Moko Erna, who is with Harif General Partners, which has been doing a lot across the continent. And I know your founder is incredibly passionate about getting access to affordable capital on the continent, and has expressed his frustrations. So why don't we throw to you? We'd love to hear from Harith.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Nick. I hope I am audible. You know, from our on-the-ground experience through our work on the continent, there's no doubt that these threats have been felt quite deeply and widely on this continent. Over 600 million people in Africa still have or lack access to electricity, and this accounts for about 75% of the global figure. An estimated 346 million of us on this continent are affected by the food crisis. In Nigeria alone, an overwhelming 19.5 million people don't have enough to eat. And in Central Africa, in the DRC, a quarter of that population face acute food insecurity conditions. That is a staggering 27 million people in that country alone. All this, yet we as Africa, we carry a fifth of the world's populations, and we are home to one of the world's largest and fastest growing and youngest populations. 1 in 3 people born every day is an African. Therefore, there is no doubt that how Africa responds to these threats has huge implications for the world at large. Firstly, from an energy perspective, we need to address the needs of this continent, but also address the warming climate. There is an urgent need to accelerate investment into affordable, cleaner energy on this continent. But we will need support from and all of the partnerships with the West, both from a financial and technological perspective, to ensure that these initiatives are just, fair, and also equitable. To be successful, we need access to capital on a favorable, a concessional, and as well as on an affordable basis. We are playing our part as the private sector, echoing the sentiments of Dr. Aguria, where we have launched a new renewable energy fund that will ensure that it makes a contribution to this just and equitable transition, and to also reduce the impact of carbon emissions on this continent. We have also signed up to the United Nations backed Race to Net Zero, and we would wish to rally other private sector participants to join us in these endeavors to increase energy supply on the continent and to uplift the lives of many Africans. And there's no doubt that the intersectionality between energy crisis, food, and the financial crisis, it is absolutely clear. Without a reliable energy source, economies in Africa and the world will not grow. And on the other hand, energy-related emissions, they impact impacts of climate change. And we can see that as a continent, we seem to bear the brunt of climate change more disproportionately in terms of what we actually contribute. 1/3 of the world's droughts occur in this continent. We therefore view investment in infrastructure and a climate-resistant infrastructure as a key component to fighting these overall risks and alleviating the impact that we are feeling. And as echoed by the previous speakers, the drive to digitalize will be key in bringing sufficient investment into this continent. In tandem, regionalization, in other words, ensuring a locally sourced food and product is going to be key going forward to ensure that we have our security in food and also ensure our economies grow. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those that don't know about the Race to Zero and Harith's recent announcement, you should look at over 1,000 businesses around the world have signed up. And what that means is that they have to commit to actually reduce and decarbonize their carbon footprint. And yet only 11 or so African businesses have joined that. And so congratulations to you on your leadership. Next, I want to briefly get some thoughts from Dr. Aroma Salufu of the Africa Youth Growth Foundation before returning to our speakers for feedback. You have the floor, Dr. Salufu.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure and great honor to be with you on this very auspicious occasion to have a global meeting and conversation around global issues and challenges. Truly, I'm sorry I'm not right in the office right now because this is noon on Saturday in Abuja, Nigeria. So it's wedding all over the place. So I reckon with the submission of all the speakers, and I agree with their submissions and views on all the issues, particularly on the issues we are treating today. Averting the food, energy, and financial crisis globally. And of course, I will be speaking particularly from how it affects, Africa and how best, we could avert the threat as we see it, today. Today, in Africa, we have these challenges long before now, but of course, COVID-19 pandemic, aggravated the entire situation. The war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, also aggravated the situation. And so Africa is most at the receiving end of the entire crisis. Be it the food, the energy, and the financial crisis. But for us to address, this crisis, we have one fundamental challenge that has really, been a major threat to our, response to all of these issues, even before now, and that is leadership. Leadership and leadership recruitment process. You cannot tackle, all of these issues without strong, formidable, and focused, disciplined leadership at all levels of governance. And so Africa is still contending with this challenge. There's a lot of corruption across various, countries in Africa, and of course we still have ineptitude of leadership. And again, you look at the fact that elections are one of the major ways to actually recruit leaders to positions. Our elections are undermined and the credibility of the process cannot be guaranteed. Nigeria is looking at having its election next year, and a lot of processes, a lot of preparations have been put in place towards the election come next year. We still have the challenge of ensuring that, yes, we have credible, fair, and free election. And of course, I understand that the Independent National Electoral Commission is working very hard to assert itself and also determine its independence in the entire process. So we will be calling on the international communities to actually give maximum support and cooperation to Nigeria in guaranteeing that we have credible, free, and fair election come next year. Of course, the same should be extended to the rest of Africa. Now, in terms of in terms of response to this threat, leadership is key. Number two is that you also look at the fact that over the years, Africa has been struggling, to work and cooperate among itself, transportation infrastructure, intra-continental, infrastructure has been, poorly or non-available, for many decades. There's no connecting flights among African countries. There's no, rail line among African countries connecting different African countries. And so all of these, actually impact negatively on the capacity of the continent to respond to this threat. You're looking at food, energy, and financial crisis. Now, in terms of the food crisis, there's the Continental Free Trade Agreement and Free Trade Area already in place by the African Union. We would expect that the world should give support to Africa to maximally, activate, drive, and indeed implement the Continental Free Trade, Agreement, and to see that all countries in Africa produce and exchange among themselves to be able to serve the underserved and be able to also see that, through that process, there's a lot of, recruitment and employment of huge youth population. And
thank you, Dr. Salafu. We'd love to come back, but I want to make sure we give our speakers enough time. There's a lot there, and thank you so much for joining us from Abuja, and shout out to all of our Nigerians on the chat. I can see lots of Nigerian flags, but I want to make sure we've got enough time to respond. So first, each of our speakers have 5 minutes each to respond. So I'm going to go first to you, Dr. Gurria. You know, there's a lot there to respond, and then we'll come to Barbie. Thank you.
Thank you. It's like a perfect storm, and all the elements conspire against development. They conspire against the well-being of the people. There's still a pandemic, we sometimes forget. The problem is we're not preparing well for the next one. For the next one that will surely come. So we're talking about the health side, but then when the crisis, when the food inflation and the food crisis turns into hunger, then it becomes real. And because, you know, when people starve because they can't get enough food, because it's not only a question of inflation, it's also a question of scarcity, of availability. I would say also the same thing accounts for energy, because developing countries need the energy just as much as developed countries. And of course, not all of them can pay the price, but people cannot pay the prices. Again, you have a question of inflation in terms of the price, but you have scarcity in terms of availability. And of course, richer countries can actually go out there and get it at any price. Now, again, when the financial issues are not addressed, they become a debt crisis. Again, developing countries have a big debt crisis. By the way, I did not mention that this time around, China has to help resolve the problem of the debt crisis, in particular in developing countries, because they have become such an important creditor to all the developing countries, and I would say particularly in Africa. And also the fact that we have a war, It's a European war, but it's one that impacts the whole of the world. It creates uncertainty. It stops the flows of investment. It stops the flows of goods. And of course, this is on top of the fact that we already had a problem with trade that was slowing down. It became much more important, 10 times more expensive to export things, etc. Now, let me just go back briefly to what some of our participants mentioned. The question of governance and leadership, it becomes absolutely crucial, because the willingness of the West, if you will, to provide more resources, either directly or indirectly through direct foreign investment, or through flows of credit, or through grants, etc., will be in direct relationship to the governance issues, to the leadership issues, and the perception that the resources are well allocated, that they're not spilled, and that they're not wasted, and that there's no corruption. So that is absolutely crucial. Also, the willingness of the West to provide another HIPC, another debt forgiveness, will depend on the question of the quality of the governance. That is quite crucial. And last but not least, let me also say that when there's enough energy, yes, but the question is also, as our friend mentioned in the case of Africa, clean energy for Africa. That means it has to be the right type of energy, because otherwise you hawk the next generation. You know, the next generation is going to be stuck with the technology that is not proper, that is going to just increase emissions, etc. And So we have to take a look at that also. So the quality of the type of and the type of aid and the flows that are addressed to developing countries must also be taken care of.
Thank you, Dr. Gurria. Barbie, over to you for your reflections.
Yes, thank you so much. And Dr. Salifu and Dr. Jose Angel Gurria both touched on governance and leadership, which is what stuck out the most to me. I get asked all the time, like, if this is such a huge issue, what is that one person that feels like their voice doesn't matter or just feels like they are just that one single person? What can they do in order to ensure that changes are being made when it comes to food insecurity and hunger? So to me, what I always suggest is reaching out to your legislators, finding out who your city council person is, who are the people that are currently in leadership that are the ones making these decisions. A lot of the times, you know, people may feel fearful of using their voice and talking about their circumstances. But if we don't do this, then government won't know. They'll continue to use their positions of power to uplift the things that are most important to them and not necessarily the things that are most important to our communities. So, you know, we talked a little bit about elections, and I just wanted to share the importance of voting. And again, of using your voice, of making your voice heard. There are so many different ways of doing this, not just contacting, you know, your local government, but signing petitions, starting actions, letting government know, again, what is important to you and why these issues are important to you. At this day and age, I don't think anyone should be going hungry. I don't think that anyone should have to make the decision between paying for a bill or being able to afford the food that they need for their family. The conference, the White House Conference on Health, Hunger, and Nutrition was something that hadn't happened in 50 years. This was not an open conversation that people were willing to have in 50 years. So we know that progress is being made. We can see the changes happening, even if they're happening at a very, you know, small scale or taking a lot of time to get to where we want to be. But we know that the changes are being made and that we're being heard, because we can see through the conference that hadn't happened in so long that the curiosity, the passion, the drive for change, this is the time. This is the time where we come together and use our voices and make sure that we're being heard and that we do the work to make the changes. I remember, you know, years ago under the Obama administration, there was this same goal to end hunger by, I don't remember what year. And it's sad that we're still having this conversation and pushing back by which year this is supposed to end, when we you know, have this commitment. There's so many organizations, there's so many people, there's so many government officials that are behind this and that know that this needs to change. So let's make sure that we're joining them. Let's make sure that we're supporting, you know, all of the social justice issues that need to be changed. Let's uplift them. Let's talk about them. Let's not hide behind fear and stigma and sometimes even vulnerability. I've talked about this before. It can be so scary. I'm someone who has used my personal story to uplift all of these things that all these changes that need to happen. And that's something that's really difficult, because it's hard standing in front of crowds and telling people I didn't have enough to feed my family. But look at where it's got me today. Look at the awareness on the issue that has happened because I took a stand and wanted a change for my family. And not only am I doing the work behind the scenes to change it, but I'm talking about it and bringing others in with me. So saying that to say, you know, our citizens, our global citizens, we're here, we're listening. We know that you care about climate, that we care about these financial crises, that we care about hunger, that we care about women and girls. There's so many things that are important to us. So let's make sure that we're gearing our actions and the things that we're doing behind those same things that are important to us so that we can actually see the changes as we move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbie. And a lot of people resonated asking in the chat how they can take action, as you mentioned. One way is you can download the Global Citizen app. There are plenty of actions to take on all the issues we've been talking about. And as Barbie said, if you are in the United States, there is an important election this Tuesday, We partner with Headcount, and there's lots of great information on the app and other places on how you can register, make sure you're voted, and go out and express your voice. Thanks, Barbie. Okay, I want to go to our second round of panelists right up, and then I'm going to go through three, and then I'll come back to our speakers for feedback. But firstly, I want to turn to Maria Fernanda Cubas. Maria, over to you.
Yes, hello. Well, hello, good evening, everyone, and good morning for the ones on this side of the world. It's been such an amazing experience to participate in this marathon, where topics that really matter have been developed with such high standards. Well, my name is Maria. I'm from Peru, and I study human medicine at the Señor Vizcaíno University here in Chiclayo, Peru. Peru has been greatly affected after the pandemic in the economy, not only affecting feeding, but also affects job offers for workers, such as young people who are finishing their university careers. It should be known that Peru has been experiencing poverty since before the pandemic situation. And in this situation is worsened even more with the appearance of COVID-19. According to reports made in Peru, it was established that the economy was affected by 5 to 10% more than previous years. Regarding food, in Peru, there are many provinces that don't have access to a healthy diet, where it can also be emphasized that they don't have access to an education. Therefore, there is no access to a good job, and finally, the money that enters to that family is not enough to complete with an adequate diet for families and also for children. Now, in this conference, I understood what must be done not only in the government, but from ourselves as a population and as families. It is necessary to mention that as a country, we need trained people to be able to face this economic problem, which we hope as a population will be solved and we will improve as a country. So I think that it's important to have a government trained for improvement from above, where we can improve as a country together with the population. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Next, I'd like to go to Maura Leary from the African Center for Economic Transformation.
Thanks so much, Mick, and thanks to everyone else. It's hard to follow so many good interventions, but I'll do my best. I actually have a comment and I have a question tying into some of what our panelists said earlier. And I want to say a quick hello to everyone joining from Ghana. I've heard a lot of shout outs to Ghana, so it sounds like there's a lot of activity in the chat, and that's where Asset is headquartered in Accra. So one of the things we are really most concerned about at Asset is that a lot of these important decisions and discussions on food, on energy, on the economy are happening in Washington, in London, in New York, and elsewhere. And these huge important decisions are being made without taking into account the needs and priorities of 1.4 billion people across 54 countries on the African continent. We've heard this time and time again, most recently after the World Bank and IMF annual meetings in these discussions about the global financial architecture. We've heard it going into COP27, and it's not a new challenge, but it's something that really needs to be solved. It really has to change. And we see this as a shared responsibility. So on the one hand, African leaders have to look beyond the domestic crisis that they rightfully care a lot about and those priorities to come together and agree on a platform of priorities and asks before these big discussions like the G20, the World Bank, IMF meetings, COP, and these other big global discussions where decisions that have huge importance for individual countries are happening. And this doesn't downplay the fact that 54 countries are going to have their own domestic needs. It doesn't mean that every African country is the same or will have the same asks, but it means that it's essential for them to find areas of commonality and tackle what can be tackled across borders, which can also help to contribute to improving domestic situations. And the platform can't be just about asking for money. It has to outline where that money will go and how to ensure that it has impact and improves lives. On the other hand, these global platforms have to do better, and they have to make sure that there's real and dedicated space to respond to and actually take into account the asks from Africa, not as a favor, but as a global imperative. These challenges are not respecting borders. We all know this, having lived through the last several years whether it's pandemic or economic crisis. This is global, this is not local. So the solutions have to be truly global and regional, not just local. There cannot be progress on food security, on climate, on energy security, on green transformation, or on the global economy without Africa. And I think this speaks a lot to the shift in power that Barbie was speaking about earlier, just on a more global scale. So this is something we're working really closely with other institutions across the continent and with our transformation leadership panel to try to tackle, to create platforms for African countries and institutions to bring their priorities together and agree on a collective position to put Africa's needs first. So that's sort of my comment and what I want to share with the group, because I think it's really important. I have a question on a slightly different thing to our speakers, and that's and it ties into this conversation. But how do we move past these approaches that take us from crisis to crisis to one that prioritizes sort of long-term development and transformation, but builds in a cushion to respond to crises when they arrive? We're always going to have crises, but it seems that we're very good at mobilizing when a crisis hits and not as good at mobilizing when we have a little bit of space to think and take the pressure off and think about long-term progress. So I'd love to hear from our panelists a little bit about their thinking about how we can move to a sort of longer-term transformation approach rather than just crisis, crisis, crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Maura. And lastly, I want to come to Hans Sebastian Mulwawan, who is with the Indonesian Students Association. Hans, over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael, for the opportunity to get involved in this discussion. Thank you to Dr. Giria and Barbie as well for sharing and advocating these triple threats issues. My name is Hans, and I'm currently in my final year of university at the National University of Singapore. And I'm serving as the Secretary General of Indonesian Students Association in Singapore. And coming from Indonesia myself, which is considered globally as one of the largest energy and food producers and exporters, it is kind of ironic because we still domestically face challenges in terms of energy and food crisis, which is why I think this is definitely a global issue that we need to collectively come together and solve. Which means although in Indonesia we do have resources, we still are not immune as well to the crisis. And I guess that brings me to my first kind of question, I guess, to Dr. Giria specifically, as you mentioned, the importance of global institutions such as the World Bank, development banks in navigating through crisis. There is certainly a dilemma between trying to solve the crisis at hand and also trying to maintain a posture in the multilateral discussions where, let's say in Indonesia, where domestic triple threats are of concerns to developing countries, leveraging on bilateral relationships compared to multilateral partnerships might result in a more effective and speedy process and solution as well. I guess I'm trying to understand as well from your perspective, is there a way for us to encourage more effectiveness in multilateral partnerships? Another thing for Barbie as well, it's really inspiring to see you advocating for these issues as well as seeing you being a global citizen. Congrats on that. And I think you mentioned something that resonates well with me, which was if everyone in the world takes a stance on trying to improve food security, energy security locally on their community, we could come together and make transformative changes that create a more sustainable world. I guess being involved mostly with youth, I realized that the awareness on this issue might not be as in an ideal state yet. And most of the Indonesians as well, who are my friends and people whom I serve, might not even understand this, the necessity and the urgency of solving these problems. And from your experience of how can we increase the awareness of the youth and advocate stronger for this for the importance of this triple threat, such that the youth could be further activated and be encouraged to solve them together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hans. Okay, I'm going to throw it back to Dr. Guerrera and Barbie. You have the floor to respond to these excellent questions and reflections. And a reminder, we will be coming to public questions. So if you've got comments or anything, please post it in the chat. But Dr. Guerrera, over to you.
Thank you. As Maria Fernanda Cubas reminded us, poverty was already there before the pandemic. poverty was already there before the worldwide inflation because of the invasion. The question is the approach, the more systemic approach to poverty, besides facing the immediate challenges having to do with things like the pandemic and the invasion, etc. Now, she said she made a very specific comment about training people, and she's absolutely right. And it takes time, and it's not a short-term issue because there's a formal education, the access of the education, the quality of the education, and the cost of the education. But there's also what I would call the EVT, the education and on the vocational training, where it's a lifelong learning, where you work with people all the time, and every enterprise becomes a school, and every big enterprise becomes a university for its own workers. Now, Maura also said, she used the word global imperatives. I would not agree. I could not agree more. I think the question of making these issues global imperatives. But she then said, well, but decisions are being taken in Washington, in London, and in Berlin, etc. And I agree. The only caveat I would put to her statement, is that that's where the money is. That's where the money can come from. These are the institutions. They happen to be based but the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and they're in Manila, and they're in Addis Ababa, and there's there are different places. But the question is, again, more capital and more leverage, and focusing on this crisis in particular. Now, they're also, the Africans have to get together. Yes, of course, the African Union already does. It already speaks for itself. They're organizing so that they can actually deliver the messages. But we know. So I would not resent a lot that people get together for the right reasons. Now, how do we go? Where do we go? Well, from crisis to crisis to a more transformative approach. The problem is we have had one crisis and another crisis and another crisis. It never seems to stop. And therefore, going from crisis to crisis, yes, we have to be responsive to the crises, and of course take the long term. In the last 15 years, it looks, Michael, like we've been addressing, from crisis to crisis, because we started in 2008. Remember, in what seemed to be a problem with the American banking system, and then it became a systemic system. So a systemic problem. Now, Hans Sebastian says, okay, how do you deal with the dilemma of crisis against the multilateral approach? Again, this is the same thing. You deal with both. You can only deal with crisis through a multilateral approach, number one, because no country can do it on its own, and multilateral approaches are the only ones. Globalization is not gone. Globalization is not retreating. It is simply changing, and it is the fault of governments, both developed and developing, that we have not managed globalization well enough. But it is really the both. You deal with the multilateral approaches in order to deal with crises, and also with more stable moments where you have a little bit more time to breathe. and to think rather than to react to the next crisis.
Thank you, Dr. Gurria. Just the point you were mentioning about, you know, the money being in Washington, and that's where we have to focus on if we are to literally
or London or whatever, you know, or Berlin,
London, or all of these places, right? But to your
Yes.
point, how do we free the funds? And one thing that Japan, the Asian Development Bank, you know, Wall Street with private capital, how do we free the funds? And I just want to give a shout out to everyone. Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados has an impressive agenda. It's called the Bridgetown Initiative on precisely how to do that. You can download the Global Citizen app and take action in support of that so that we can free the funds from those capitals. It's a really, really important point. Barbie, I want to come to you next for your reflections and comments.
Yes, thank you. I won't take up too much time, but I also wanted to talk about Mara's comments about going from crisis to crisis. It resonates so much with me because in translation to my upbringing, going from crisis to crisis means that you're living in survival mode. And this is what people in poverty do every single day. You're just trying to rescue yourself from this situation, and then the next situation comes up, and you know, this is something that we really need to move away from. So I think to combat that, what we need to do is implement true, concrete, substantial changes that have guardrails, that have guidelines, that work as preventative measures versus a rescue. I'll give a quick example. So I currently live in Kissimmee, Florida. And during the White House Conference on Hunger, Health, and Nutrition, Florida, specifically Kissimmee, was hit by Hurricane Ian. So here I am at a conference talking about food insecurity, and I now had to worry about, like, how are my kids who are back home going to get food during a hurricane when where I live, there's only one way in, one way out. You know, the roads, some of them were completely broken. There were floods everywhere. And when I got back home visiting the supermarket, I saw a picture of, I took a picture of a sign that was talking about SNAP benefits and how they were expanded to now be able to be used for hot meals until October 31st. So in my mind, we've talked a lot throughout the years about hot foods and them being, should they be accepted with the SNAP benefits and things like that. Basically, right now in the United States, if you are receiving food stamps or you know, assistance from the SNAP program, what that means is that you can go to the grocery store, you can go to the supermarket, you can buy cold meals, unprepared foods, you know, fruits, vegetables, all of those sort of things. But if that market provides something that is already made, that's something that they made at the store, something that's served hot, then you can't buy that. Because of this waiver that was approved by the USDA, people who are impacted by the hurricane could now go to this supermarket and receive a hot meal for their family that day. What does that say to me? That says to me that we have the means to make things like this more permanent so that more people can have access to the foods that they need. You know, there's so many populations of people who don't have access to things like a simple stove or a refrigerator to store their foods. So in talking about the things that avoid crises, this is something that can avoid a crisis. This is something that will help get more food to families when they need it without having to worry about, where am I going to store the food so that it doesn't go bad? How am I going to cook the food, you know, despite my current living conditions? So yeah, I think it's very important to start thinking about preventative measures. Dr. Gurria also talked about the cost of trying to recover from the medical illnesses or the things that come from, you know, not being able to eat healthily. And if you think about that, it will cost the government, the country, however you want to frame it, so much more to try to repair these diseases that can be, prevented if people are having access and can afford the nutritious meals that they need so that they won't be getting sick. Do we want to pay for a healthy America, or do we want to pay for a sick America? Because either way, the money has to be spent. But if we're taking the preventative measures to make sure less people are sick by expanding these programs and making sure that they have the funds to continue to exist, then we can prevent more people from getting sick. And Hans also talked about, my comments earlier and raising awareness. It sounds so silly to think that in 2022, we have to raise awareness on people being food insecure. But it is the sad truth, when you think food insecurity, especially because it's a phrase that can be described in so many different ways, depending on where you are located geographically. Food insecurity can mean that you don't know where your next meal comes from, but it also can mean that you have absolutely nothing to eat. So talking about these very, very, very difficult conversations that take us, or that require us to have to put our pride to the side, our genuine emotions as a human being to the side, so that we can actually have the things that we need, is something that's very hard to do, but it is something that we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbie. So we're coming to the last part of the session, and that's where we get to hear questions that have been going on in the background while we've all been talking. And I should say this is a truly global town hall. I can see flags in the chat from Zambia, India, Nigeria, the Philippines, Peru, the US, Canada, Singapore, and many, many more. So I'm going to read out 4 questions, and I'm going to give each of you, Barbie and Dr. Gurria, if we can try and keep our closing remarks around these questions to 3 to 4 minutes. The first question is from Dale in Singapore. Dale asks, what about the business and commercial food production due to excessive yields and ugly food that doesn't go to consumers, goes to waste instead of diverting the food to meet the needs of world hunger and poverty? Second question is from Nadia in Indonesia. The food crisis is caused by high price of fertilizers, which is undeniably triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So what exactly is the solution for us commoners who don't understand the geopolitics, who aren't involved at the negotiating table and are voiceless in this? Then we've got a question from Jang, also from Indonesia. There has been a debate on how to protect the vulnerable in the wisest way. Do you think subsidies are important to maintaining energy price at lower affordable prices, considering the costs such as the acceleration towards renewables? Is there a role for energy subsidies? And finally, there was a more broader question around what can Indonesia's presidency of the G20 this year do to ensure the commitment of the developed countries in their promises around climate financing and averting this food crisis? So there's a lot there to unpack, and I know we're coming to the end. So do the best you can, Dr. Gurria and Barbie, but over to you, Dr. Gurria.
Thank you. The food waste is a feature, a permanent feature in our food production. And a lot of the food is actually rots and cannot be taken to market. The problem of the waste is that about a third of the production is not used because it literally cannot go to the places where it is more needed. So it's difficult. It has to do with infrastructure. It also has to do with roads. It has to do with freight that is refrigerated, etc. It's a problem. It has always been a problem. We're slowly making progress, but not fast enough. Now, the question of fertilizer price and the fertilizer and the increase of the price of food. Yes, absolutely. But what can somebody else, what can people do when they're not sitting around the table? Well, most of us are not sitting around the table. There are only a handful of people sitting around the table. But the question of awareness, the question of what to do, the question of what to, how to, the invasion, for example. Well, you can continue to condemn the invasion all the time. Now, that will not bring down the fertilizer price, not in the short run, but it will also maybe diffuse the main problem, which is the invasion itself. But I'm not being very specific in there. But again, there's not very much that we individually can do, but together we can. Now, subsidies to energy. Michael, last year in 2021, we doubled the subsidies to energy. We did it exactly wrong. We went in exactly the wrong direction. The subsidies to energy should not be utilized, because we are killing with one hand what we're trying to do with the other, which is we're trying to reduce the emissions. We're trying to reduce the use of fossil fuels, and by subsidizing that, we are absolutely promoting their use. Now, developing countries against developed countries. Why is Indonesia? It's wonderful that Indonesia, and next year it's going to be India, and next year I think it's going to be Brazil, whatever. It's wonderful that a number of developing countries are hosting the G20, because it is the best way in which we can tell, because the countries that are hosts are the ones who prepare the agenda, or the ones who have a chance to develop the agenda, and they have a chance to put one or two, maybe three items on the agenda that are crucial. And therefore, the issues having to do with developing countries are going to be in the agenda of the G20, which is where they can be addressed and they can be solved.
Thank you, Dr. Gurria, and thank you for your incredible participation. There's been a lot of shout outs. People have learned so much from your knowledge. Really appreciate you joining us. And finally, Barbie, final words, over to you in these last 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you so much. So in regards to food being thrown out and things like that, what I can say is that here in the United States, there are many corporations and supermarkets that donate food that is considered food waste or ugly food. But as Dr. Gurria spoke, then you have to think about the transportation costs, right? The people that are providing those foods or selling those foods are not going to be making the same amount of money from food that is, discounted or considered as ugly food. So they're still taking on their own, hits to their finances or their income or whatever the case may be to provide this food. So it's something that hasn't been completely figured out. And then also you have to think about liability. A lot of these corporations may face some liability issues if these foods make people sick. So I think that that's one of the reasons why it's not something that is more broadly discussed or used as a solution. But I can, thankfully say that in the United States, there are some of these options where these ugly foods can be donated and either given to food banks or other sources that can use them, even though they do have a lower shelf life. The comment about being voiceless, I think that one touched my heart the most, because I felt like I was voiceless before I started doing this work 14 years ago. I was very silent about my struggles. I was very embarrassed about the things that I was going through, not taking under account that this wasn't my fault. and that this was, you know, something that my family has faced for years. So what I would say to the person that wrote that in the chat is to realize your power and utilize that power. You're not voiceless. It's just you have to find the right room with the people that are willing to listen to you. And that can be difficult. It can be time consuming, but I absolutely want to remind you and empower you that you do have a voice and that it does matter, and that your one voice, again, if one person believes that their voice can work from every community, imagine the power, you know, when we all come together. I can't speak about the energy subsidies, unfortunately, because my expertise is more on hunger, but I hope that, you know, I contributed enough information.
Absolutely. Well, I really want to thank the two of you, and I want to thank everyone. Barbie, again, congratulations on this year's Global Citizen Prize. And in closing, that she spoke about having a platform. Global Citizen will soon be opening applications for the 2023 Global Citizen Prize. Follow us, download the app at Global Citizen to stay abreast, nominate people in your community and others for that award. It's a fantastic platform to raise your voice, meet with world leaders and others. But I really want to thank everyone. This is not a simple issue, it's complex, but through this we've learned a lot, and also how we can use our voices. So thank you, Dr. Gurria, thank you, Barbie, and thank you to all of our amazing panelists and participants. Thank you, everyone.